What's good, guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are comparing Saucony's Endorphin Pro 3 with Saucony's Endorphin Speed 3. Let's get into it. Now, you guys have heard of these shoes. This is Saucony's Endorphin line, and both the Speed 3 and the Pro 3 are fantastic upgrades and definitely worth considering. And we can't forget about the Shift 3, but that isn't as comparable as these two. So in this video we're going to be going over the specs just so you know how they compare. Then we're going to be talking about ride, and I'm going to let you know who I think each of these shoes is for, and if you had to choose which one you should probably buy. Let's get started with price. The Endorphin Speed 3 rings in at $170. The Endorphin Pro 3 rings in at $225. Both of these shoes are available at Roadrunner Sports, and I will provide links in the show notes below. Oh, and full disclosure, both of these shoes were sent to me for the purpose of review. However, the thoughts and opinions in this video are my own. Saucony claims that a US men's size 9 in the Speed 3 tips the scale at 8.1 ounces or 229 grams. However, in my size, a US men's size 13, the Speed 3 tips the scale at 9.8 ounces or 278 grams. The Endorphin Pro 3 in a US men's size 9 tips the scale at only 7.2 ounces or 204 grams. And in my size, a US men's size 13, the Pro 3 tips the scale at 8.9 ounces or 251 grams. Both of these are pretty light shoes, but the Pro 3 is very light. Now, I do have one more very unfair comparison, and that is weight after running in them. And I say it's an unfair comparison because wait till you hear these numbers. They actually don't make any sense. After a run that I thought was pretty sweaty, the Speed 3 weighs in at 10.8 ounces or 307 grams. That's a 10.43% increase in weight just from sweat. The Endorphin Pro 3, after an even more sweaty run, I would assume, now tips the scale at 10.4 ounces or 296 grams. That's an increase of 17.92%. So I realized that I really need to control the experiment if I'm going to give you guys the numbers, and I usually like the sensational nature that goes with showing how much weight these shoes put on. But if we were to take my experiment at face value, the Speed 3 puts on less weight when running. But guys, that's not true at all. In fact, ignore that last part. Both the Speed 3 and the Pro 3 are neutral shoes, and they fit true to size. The Speed 3 has 38mm in the heel, 28mm in the forefoot for an 8mm drop. The Pro 3 has 39.5mm in the heel, 31.5mm in the forefoot, also for an 8mm drop. So when we consider the drop, both these shoes ride very similar in that way. Now look, if money were no object, you would probably buy both of these shoes and you would be extremely happy with them. The Speed 3 and the Pro 3 actually complement each other. This is your lighter race day shoe, and this is your very slightly heavier, but possibly a little more durable training, daily trainer shoe. It can actually be used for all of those things. We're going to talk about durability in just a second, but let's just look at the heel collar. Now, the style of the heel collar are very similar on both of these shoes. However, the Pro 3 is just slightly thinner. I would say it's about 40% thinner in thickness than the Speed 3, and while the thickness of the heel collar isn't really noticeable when the shoes are on my foot, because both of them feel exactly the same when it comes down to the amount of cushioning that's actually against your ankle. The Pro 3 has significantly less just to save weight, which obviously makes sense as this is your race day shoe. The Speed 3, however, isn't overdoing it on that padding around the heel collar. It's actually quite minimal. It's only when you compare it to the Pro 3 that it seems a little thicker. The heel counters on these shoes are just a little different. The heel counter on the Pro 3 is just a little looser. Now, there is a little bit of rigidity in the center of the heel counter, but you can see it's not very rigid at all. And that doesn't take anything away from the Pro 3. I had a great heel lockdown in this shoe, and I think mostly it comes down to saving weight. Because on the Speed 3, you can see we have this external piece of plastic that just strengthens that heel counter, and it's very rigid in the Speed 3. So perhaps if you like a stiffer heel counter in your shoe, you might get some irritation or some heel rubbing if the heel counter is a little looser. Perhaps the Speed 3 will be better for you because of that reason alone. The Speed 3 and the Pro 3 both have engineered mesh uppers, and this is the first instance where I think that the overall and long-term resilience is going to become apparent, because on the Pro 3, the upper is just a super thin mesh. And you can see there's kind of a shiny filament underneath this top wide layer of mesh. But the mesh on the Pro 3 is just so super thin, and when you put your foot in, you can see your sock. It's all just perfectly engineered for race day, for reducing the most amount of weight. The Speed 3, on the other hand, is a little more traditional. And when I say traditional, it's actually a very light engineered mesh. When you kind of manipulate it between your fingers, you can find out how thin it really is. But it's not translucent in any way. So it gives the appearance of being thicker than it actually is. And for that reason alone, I think just because it is just a little thicker than the translucent mesh on the Pro 3, it's going to last a little longer. The tongue on the Speed 3 is very thin, it's gusseted, it provides a nice mid-foot lockdown, but just something I want to draw your attention to. Now, I did say that these shoes do fit true to size, and I'm not second guessing that. They do fit true to size, but we can see just how close my laces are between both eyelet chains, and that tells me that there may be just a little bit more volume in this shoe than there are in other shoes. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In this case, I think it just comes down to aesthetics. But you can see that in order to get that nice mid-foot lockdown, lockdown, I do have to cinch my laces quite a bit. Now, even though I said that the Speed 3 has a very thin tongue, when compared to the tongue on the Pro 3, it's actually pretty thick, because the tongue on the Pro 3 is just a very thin piece of suede, or it's a faux suede. Both the Pro 3 and the Speed 3 are vegan and they're made with recycled materials, so we know it's not actually suede. And this tongue is also gusseted, and I also have a great midfoot lockdown, but the tongue on the Pro 3 also has 3 holes coming down the middle, and we kind of see them here, and that is going to provide ventilation. And if you saw my solo Pro 3 review, you know that I was a little surprised that because of these ventilation holes in the tongue, I thought I might get a little bit of lace bite across the top of my foot. That didn't happen. Both the Pro 3 and the Speed 3 locked down across my foot absolutely beautifully. I had no complaints on the fit of either shoe. Both shoes have very minimal overlays. The Speed 3 has slightly thicker overlays down the eyelet chain, but obviously weight isn't as much of a concern on this shoe as it is on this shoe. At least they're not competing against each other. And the Speed 3 also has a little overlay just to provide a little bit of support around the front of the toe box. Okay, let's talk about the midsole. Both these shoes are using Power Run PB. That's Saucony's PBA-based foam. It is super light, it is super responsive. It really is an excellent foam. However, on the Speed 3, we are using an S-curved nylon plate, and in the Pro 3, we're using a carbon fiber plate. And yes, there are obvious differences with these two shoes, but the plate material is the main thing that makes these shoes ideally suited for different things. A carbon fiber plate is going to be lighter, it's going to provide a little more snap in the toe off. However, with a carbon fiber plate comes a different feeling, and I often find that I do get plate fatigue when I run in carbon plated shoes all the time. And if we do the bend test, we can see that this Pro 3 is actually quite stiff. I'm using quite a bit of force to bend that up. But then with the Speed 3 and the nylon plate, we can see that I can actually bend it quite a bit. And that makes the Speed 3 a little more of a forgiving ride when you're out training. Now, obviously, Saucony has put a lot of money into R&D. They know that you are likely going to be putting more distance in the Speed 3 than the Pro 3, because ideally the Pro 3 is made for race day. Let's come down to the outsole, and we're going to look at the Endorphin Pro 3 first. We can see we've got a couple different cutouts of the midsole material, and in both cases we can see the carbon fiber plate right here. If we look at this cutout through the middle, it says Speed Roll technology on the carbon fiber plate, and again, we're using these cutouts just to save a little bit of weight. On the Pro 3, we can see there is just a little bit different in the outsole rubber pattern and no cutouts. Now, both of these shoes are using Saucony's XT900 outsole rubber, super grippy. Haven't encountered any situation where I've been unsure of my footing. Oh, and before we go on, I do just want to mention that the nylon plate in the Speed 3 has these little wingtips that come up on the side. We can see the nylon plate kind of sticking out right there, and the wing parts of these plate are just going to provide a little more guidance and support as you're rolling through your gait cycle. Speaking of support, both these shoes are remarkably stable, even when turning corners, at slow paces, at fast paces. That's because Saucony, in both cases, in the Speed 3 and the Pro 3, has made a wider base. And combined with the wingtips of the nylon plate in the Speed 3, that just makes the Speed 3 just super stable at all paces. Now, if you saw my comparison against Nike's Next Percent 2 with the Pro 3, you know that I was talking about the Next Percent 2, saying how unstable it is. So for me, one of the biggest benefits of the Endorphin Pro 3 is its stability at all paces. So don't think you have to run fast or what you think is fast just to buy this super shoe. You don't. This will really work for everyone. So let's get down to ride, because this is where the rubber meets the road. And I do have to say that I have got nothing but good things to say about the Endorphin Pro 3. I think this is one of the best super shoes to come out this year. And for me, at least, it is the biggest contender against the Nike Next Percent 2, which up until this shoe came out, I thought was the best, at least for me. Last year I ran in the Endorphin Pro and the Endorphin Speed 2, and I gotta say that even though the Endorphin Pro was lighter, I tended to put a lot more miles in my Endorphin Speed 2. So I would say that I like the Endorphin Speed 2 better than the Endorphin Pro, but this year, Saucony has made such huge strides with the amount of cushioning they've got in both these shoes, but especially the Endorphin Pro 3, that if you can swing the price tag of $225, I am telling you, you are going to be over the moon with the Endorphin Pro 3. Now, Saucony is using their Speed Roll technology, which is just their forefoot geometry, and that contributes to the smooth ride and the smooth toe off in both of these shoes. But the amount of pop and snap in the Endorphin Pro 3 is just a treat every time I put on these shoes and take them out to run fast. But let's just be real for a second. The Endorphin Speed 3 is $170. That's $55 less than the Endorphin Pro 3. That is a big chunk of change. And because of that savings, I actually think that the Endorphin Speed 3 represents a better value. And that is because the shoe is probably going to last longer. Now, when I say it's going to last longer, I'm not talking about the foam. Both of these shoes are using Power Run PB. It's the same foam. We've got a lot of outsole rubber on both of these shoes, so that's not going to be the deciding factor. I think just the construction of the upper is what's going to make the Endorphin Speed 3 last a little longer than the Pro 3 if you were to run the same amount of miles in them. Also, let's put the Pro 3 away for a second. If you wanted to run a race in the Endorphin Speed 3, you 100% absolutely could. And I'm going to say that this shoe will work well for a 5K all the way up to the marathon. Last year, the Endorphin Speed 2 was one of my favorite shoes. This year, I think the Endorphin Speed 3 is actually going to be the best shoe for the most amount of people. This shoe is comfortable when running slow, it is stable underfoot, and when you pick up the pace, the pop that you get, the feedback from the shoe, and the comfort with which it feels like you are moving forward is undeniable. And all that for only $170. So if you can swing both, I definitely recommend both. I wish they were cheap enough for everyone to afford both, but if you can't get both and you want to save a little bit of money, probably go with the Endorphin Speed 3. I am almost certain that almost every one of you are going to love the experience of running in this shoe. Of course, because I do have both, I will not be racing in the Speed 3. This is going to be relegated to training days, because for me, the Endorphin Pro 3 is the best super shoe available at the moment. Guys, thanks for staying all the way to the end of the video. This has been my review of the Endorphin Speed 3 against the Endorphin Pro 3. If you have made it this far in the video, first of all, thank you. Second of all, why don't you drop the running shoe emoji in the comments, just so I know who you are and that you stayed to the end of this video. Be kind, be happy, run well. I'll see you in a couple of days.